Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, I'm Alex, and this is my channel Frank Fiction, where I talk about pretty much anything I want related to books and the book publishing industry. As you can probably tell by the title of the video, today I'm going to be talking about the books that I read in January of 2023. And it was a little bit of a slow start to the year. I only got through 3 books, but that's still a solid start. And those 3 books are Burial Rites by Hannah Kent, Afterworlds by Scott Westerfeld, and Poison by Sarah Pinborough. What's funny about all 3 of these books is that I have owned them for many years. I've owned them for a really long time. Afterworlds in particular, I've owned for the last 8 years. It's been staring at me non-stop on my shelf, and I figured it was finally time to read it. I'm making a more concerted effort this year to read more books that I already own rather than buying more books. I'm going to be keeping track of the books that I purchased throughout the year, and I will be making a video in December about the number that I purchased and how much I paid for those books compared to the number of books that I read that I already own or perhaps borrowed from the library. So first up is Burial Rites, which, lovely cover, by the way. This is the fictionalized story of a real-life woman named Agnes Magnusdóttir who was convicted of double homicide in Iceland, and she was the last person in that country to be executed by beheading. While she awaits her execution, she is forced to stay with a family that does not want her. The only person that she really finds comfort in is a priest named Todi, who she personally requested, and he's meant to kind of bring her to absolution before the day of her execution so that her spirit could be at peace. Over the course of the novel, we learn how Agnes got into her current situation and the ways in which that she kind of wishes that her life had taken a different turn. I would say that this story offers a quiet sort of suspense. We learn Agnes's backstory very slowly, sometimes through things that she is narrating to herself in her head, and other times from information that she is telling other people. The story is more atmospheric rather than tense, and one of the things I really liked about it was the unique writing style. So we have first-person perspective from Agnes, and then we switch to third-person omniscient for all of the other characters. But the strange part was that those sections are not separated by chapter. They actually happen within a chapter. So it'll be going along, it'll have Agnes's part, and then it'll give a little symbol denoting like, okay, we're switching perspective, and then it'll go to one of the other characters, which is a rather small cast in the book. But I had never experienced a story quite like that, where you go back and forth between first person and third person. At least I can't remember a book like that off the top of my head. So that was pretty unique. And what kept me reading was the desire really to know whether Agnes actually committed the murders. Now, of course, this is a fictionalized tale, so the author took some liberties, but she did base everything as much as she could on historical facts and biographies of Agnes's life. And so this is kind of an estimation of things that potentially could have happened. She's a very tragic character because her upbringing was very difficult. She was abandoned by her mother. She basically had no opportunities afforded to her her entire life. So she makes decisions based off of information that she has at the time, as much as any of the rest of us do. And unfortunately, those decisions have gotten her into trouble. One of the things I also really liked was watching the family's responses to Agnes over the course of the story, because I would not say that they ever grow to love her, but they do grow to at least have some respect for her, and that's more than she's gotten from anybody in a really long time. If you are a fan of historical fiction, Icelandic culture, or murder trials from the 1800s, I would say that this book might be for you. I think it's very well written, and I gave it 4 stars. Up next is Afterworlds by Scott Westerfeld. This book, I had a lot to say about it, and I've never mentioned this before on my channel, but I have been running a book review blog called frankfiction.blog since I was in college in 2014. When I typed out my book review for this, it ended up being over 3 typed pages long, and I am not going to go over every single freaking point that I wanted to make about this story. If you're interested in the entire review, I will link that in the description down below, but I'm not going to make you listen to all of that right now. Afterworlds is going to be a little bit difficult to explain, so bear with me. Darcy Patel is a young woman who just graduated from high school, and she wrote a novel during November for NaNoWriMo. She felt like it was good enough that she submitted it to an agent, and she's actually being published. She got this ridiculous signing bonus of $150,000 for her first book Afterworlds, and $150,000 for the sequel, which she hasn't started yet. So with her newfound wealth, she has decided to move to New York City to live the writer's lifestyle. What's interesting about this book is that we actually get to read the novel that Darcy is editing throughout the story, and the version that we're reading is the final copy of the book. And that book is denoted with these black border pages throughout. And that story is the tale of Lizzie, who is about the same age as Darcy, and she ends up narrowly escaping a terrorist attack with her life by pretending to be dead. And she actually pretends to be dead so well that she transports herself to the flip side, which is the afterworld, essentially. And in the flip side, she ends up meeting this young, attractive man named Yamaraj, and he tells her, hey, I'm going to save your life, but I want you to forget that this ever happened, because it would be a lot safer and easier for you to just go back and live your life normally. And of course, Lizzie doesn't end up listening, and problems ensue from there. That's the story. Since I have owned this book for 8 years, I was actually the same age as Darcy when I bought this book. So I was the target demographic at the time when I purchased this. I'm no longer the target demographic. And I have a feeling that my response to this story probably would have been significantly different reading it then than reading it now. And the main reason that I say that is because when I graduated from college, I had a marketing internship at a book publisher, and I wrote press releases for them, and my goal was to move to New York City and work for either Penguin Random House or Simon & Schuster. And I actually had contacts at both of those companies, and I called them and I found out how much money they paid for entry-level positions, and I got to frantically budgeting because it was absolutely horrible. Like it was dismal how much money they paid, and so I was trying to figure out, you know, rent and food and transportation. I did not end up moving to New York City, but when Darcy moves there and she talks about how like she found this apartment that she thought was perfect and it's $3,500 a month, I could envision that she is very much like a pie in the sky person, that she's like, oh no, I'm just gonna make it work, even though her sister, who's a math genius and is the one who's like managing her money for her, tells her that if she wants to have an apartment for $3,500 a month, she's only gonna have $17 left a day for food and other expenses. That is a very realistic view of what it would be like to live in New York City on a limited budget, and it's not glamorous at all. Writing and a career in books in general is a labor of love. It's not something that most people ever make like a very good living on unless you've been in the industry for many years. I wonder, had I read this then, would I still have thought it was glamorous to move to New York City, or would I have thought, man, that's a bad idea? Like, did this dissuade any teenagers from wanting to go and move to Manhattan to work in writing or in publishing? Probably not, but it's a curious question. I really liked the way that this book was structured in alternating chapters because each chapter was very bite-sized. The one thing I did not like about it, though, is that in my opinion, neither story holds up on its own. Because for Darcy, what makes her side interesting is that we're seeing the book that she's editing throughout the novel. And she's talking about her difficulties in rewriting an ending and all of these different aspects of being an author, and we get to see her final work. If we were missing that context, I personally think that her side of the story would have been extremely boring. On the other side with Lizzie's story, when Darcy ends up submitting her novel to copy editing, they list out each character, and then they give the character description, so you know what they look like, what their personality is and everything. And when that happens, Darcy ends up realizing that she is absolutely terrible at writing characters because they have no depth. She doesn't even really give appearance descriptions for anybody in her story. And the thing that is really irritating is that remains true even after she's done editing it. Like the final copy that we read, none of the characters really feel like people. They're more caricatures of a person. I didn't think that as a standalone story without the reference of Darcy writing this novel, that if I had picked up Afterworlds, that I would have thought in any way, shape, or form that it was a good book. Now, I am not a fan of paranormal romance, and I don't generally read YA, so again, maybe had I read this 8 years ago, I would have felt a little bit different, but I just wasn't that big of a fan. It was okay, but I wasn't that big of a fan. And this is the last thing I'm going to say about Afterworlds. This is an LGBTQ novel, which is not referenced at all on any of the text on the back of the book. I don't have any problems with this being a sapphic romance. I actually thought that that was a really great addition to this story. The weird part of it is that in universe, Darcy ends up having her first relationship with another writer who is a woman named Imogen, who's an openly lesbian character. Imogen wrote a novel and got it published, and one of the things that she received as feedback was that people didn't like that it had a girl-on-girl kiss scene in it. It was considered controversial, and it wasn't advertised in any way on the back of her novel that it was a sapphic romance. The part that I find a little too meta about this is that Westerfeld obviously didn't include that on the back of his novel either, even though the romance is a lot more than just a kiss. It is a significant portion of the story. I would argue it's the biggest plot point of the story, other than Darcy editing her book. So why didn't Westerfeld end up including that in the marketing of his book? Did he think that he would end up missing out on people reading it because they'd be like, oh, I don't want to read a female and female romance? And if so, isn't that a little cynical? I just find that rather odd because LGBTQ books are so hot right now. Like, you can walk into any Barnes & Noble and there's going to be an entire section of them, which I think is really great. It's wonderful to have representation for all people. I just don't like it when it's a significant element of a book and then they just choose not to mention it. And I honestly think that it was for the purposes of selling more copies, because if they advertise it more as a straight romance, then they're going to get more people to buy it. And I don't know, maybe 8 years ago it was considered more controversial to write a queer romance than it is today. I mean, trends change so rapidly. But the other part, and this was the part to me that was the most weird of the fact that this is an LGBTQ book, is Darcy never had a romance with a man, like at any point in her life. Imogen is her first love. Yet she wrote a conventional male and female romance, a point that Imogen never brings up to her is like, by the way, why did you make this a straight romance instead of a queer one? It's just never brought up. That's enough for me talking about this book, but overall I would give it a rating of about 3.5 stars. It was solid. It wasn't great, but it was solid. And then last and certainly least is Poison, A Wicked Snow White Tale. It is a Snow White retelling that has, you know, the beautiful princess, the evil queen, the charming prince, and a poisoning, and it turns them kind of on their head. Not really, but kind of. I knew going into this that I'm not generally a fan of fairy tale retellings because they're everywhere, a dime a dozen. You could go walk into any bookstore and you would find 5 Snow White, 5 Cinderella, and 20 Beauty and the Beast retellings. So you might be wondering why I ended up picking up this book if I'm not a fan of retellings, and the answer is very simple. I saw it at a Half Price Books and it had a debossed cover, which is very beautiful. And in case you're not sure what that is, embossing is where the image on a book stands out in relief. It's the part that you can feel. Debossed is when it's kind of stamped in, creates an indentation. So I thought that the cover was unique. I was, of course, also at a Half Price book, so that meant that I was not paying full price for this book. I actually got it pretty inexpensively, and it was short, because it's a novella, so I knew I wasn't going to be spending much time reading it. I really set myself up for failure. I did it to myself. Damn, holding up these books, I'm getting a hand cramp. In this version, Lilith, the evil stepmother queen, is 24 and Snow White is 20. I was having a really hard time envisioning Lilith as anything other than a 30 to 40-year-old woman, and that might have something to do with the cartoon adaptations. She, of course, looked older in that than being 24. There should be enough of an age gap where it makes sense for the queen to be jealous of Snow White's beauty. And in my opinion, that's another YA indicator, because all of the main characters that are really of any importance or have any sort of romantic inclinations in this book are in their late teens or early 20s. Lilith is also petty and jealous of Snow White in a way that no mature person would be, but I guess you could argue it's the same for the original cartoon, so who am I to say anything? No one in YA is generally very mature anyway. And in my personal opinion, as somebody who doesn't typically gravitate towards it, I just typically find it lacking in any sort of emotional depth. The repetitive phrases were also very annoying because it kept repeating things like, she was the queen, she was beautiful, or some version of how Lilith would have their fear because she didn't have their love. Sometimes those phrases would only be a couple sentences apart, so it might say something like, she is the queen, and then give 2 sentences, and then it would state, she is the queen again. I didn't need that. You could just cut that out. It would have made it a lot better. Pinborough also didn't really do that good of a job of explaining Lilith's motivations in here. I'm not going to spoil anything for you, but there are certain scenes that gave me whiplash, and I was like, why can't you just make it consistent? That's it. The best parts of the novella, because it wasn't all bad, a lot of it was bad, but it wasn't all bad. The best part of the novel was definitely the horror elements, the grisly murders and the ghastly fates. The twist at the end was 100% my favorite part, and in my opinion saved this entire novella, because up until the last 40 pages, I was gonna give this book a solid 2 stars, but the ending was a 4-star. So I guess this gets a 3 because math? And with that, that is the end of the books that I read in January. I currently am reading Gilchrist, which I am most of the way into right now, and that is another horror novel that I am absolutely enjoying, and I'm really excited to talk to you guys about that next month. So until then, until my next video, whatever that might be, I really hope that you all have a wonderful day or evening, that you all stay safe out there, and I'll see you next time.